not having control of Greek cultural goods, that actually harms its members, the Greek community, in seeing themselves as important as any other, as valuable as any other state group, as good as the French or as good as the Germans or what have you. Because the Germans and French control the vast majority of their cultural goods, where the Greeks don't. Right? I think I might be able to, I'm not, I'm trying to because the liberal tradition with individual rights is by far the dominant one. If I go anywhere with, once I start talking about group rights, I think I'm going to get on really shaky ground. So I need a way to do this and maintain rights being, the rights claims being made by individuals. So I see an analogy there, and that's mostly what I'm trying to do, is figure out a way I can still say an individual Greek person gets to say to the international community, you got to help me get my shit back. You got to help Greece get its shit back so that I can legitimately see myself as worthwhile as these French guys do. I'm very wary of seeming like a whiny, bleeding heart kind of seeing a victim in everybody. And I think I'm starting to push that if I make that argument. It might work out. That seems, right now I'm thinking that's probably my best hope. But I don't want to go so far that it now just seems, everybody gets a right to claim anything that there's, I'm like 4 generations removed from Scotland. And I think it would be bogus for me to claim that my rights are somehow violated because Scotland is not independent from Britain. Right? That just is like, whatever, man. You're so far removed from that, who the hell cares? And that's what I'm worried about with that argument I'm developing, that a modern Greek person is so far removed from when the Elgin marbles were removed that it might be the same kind of thing.
I was just wondering, I understand as far as a lot of the religious ceremonies, like in Italy, each town has like a relic, so they would obviously bring it up for holidays, but I know you were talking about giving things back as far as people who own them, like museums or whatnot. They don't do that for private collectors, right? For someone who's just purchased it for their own having it. I mean, how would a nation say to, Steve, can you please give back such and such to this country that you purchased? So,
yeah.
Is there something along those lines? I mean, I'm not sure how that would work.
No, that's a good point. Institutions, particularly state-run institutions, are going to be the ones that my arguments work best on, right? Because they're going to be instruments of the state who is responsible for maintaining a just society. So, state schools, state-run museums, those are going to be the ones that my argument works best on, that I think individuals can most legitimately go, you got our stuff, you got to at least offer it to us.
I just meant law-wise. There's nothing that says...
well, the legal stuff, no. Right now, the laws, no. In fact, even in the international stuff, there's a grandfather clause. Any of these goods acquired before 1970, as long as they were legally gotten, do not have to be returned. But things acquired after 1970, even if they're legally acquired, right? If they weren't legally required, right? If the Elgin marbles had been taken in 1972 from the Ottomans who occupied Greece, they would have to be offered back to Greece once Greece got its independence. Right? But since they were taken in 1801, I think 1801 to 1804, then the law doesn't apply to them. In individual cases, same thing. NAGPRA doesn't apply to individuals, right? So if you dig up something in your backyard, some native good in your backyard, you can keep it. If a government project digs it up while making a road, they need to get experts in to find out which group it probably belongs to and offer it to them. Right? So as far as I understand it, the actual laws in our country are very different for the private and the state things. Now, I think the moral argument might still work, right? That the individual ought to offer it back. But because individual rights for maintaining my individual private property also fall under that sort of liberal tradition, I think it's going to be hard-pressed to justify a law that requires individuals to return legitimately purchased or legitimately acquired goods, private persons. So I think private persons would be able to resist any move to make it a law, although we might still make, look, morally speaking, you'd be a better person if you offered this back.
It just seems it would start to deter museums from trying to acquire things.
Oh, yes.
Because you never know.
Yes, the whole purpose of museums would particularly if I could do it to make the move to states, not just nations, the whole purpose of museums would have to change. They'd have to be much more cooperative with the people whose goods they were displaying. Right? Because the history of museums, I mean, the museums started off from private collections. People who would just go around, particularly imperial people, British folks, French folks, who were going around conquering places. What we think of as the modern museum started just from a menagerie or a big cabinet full of goods from all around the world that somebody collected on during their imperial journeys as a soldier in the British Army or whatever. Right? What I call sugar-eating conquer monkeys. I do. I even have a tattoo. That's really the origin of museums. Is people, hey, we've just been conquering this part of Africa. Here's a display for all of my imperial homies to see what it's like to be over there while we're conquering shit. That's the real history of museums. They only later became these kinds of institutions of learning. Right? And part of the point of all this is that legacy of that imperial conquering and taking is still there. Granted, the vast majority of people who work in museums now, probably maybe all of them, because I know a few people who work in museums, and they're all very nice people who are concerned with learning stuff. Right? That doesn't mean that those museums acquired those in a morally good way. And I think this particular argument means that their keeping those things might actually harm people. People in minority groups that don't have minimal sovereignty. I think the way we run museums and maintaining those collections is actually harmful to some folks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, if something taken from a nation that didn't have sovereignty at the time, taken from them, and then it has become part of the new culture.
Yeah.
And now that is part of their identity, and giving it back would harm that culture. What happens?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And this is actually one of the other arguments that Britain has used about the Elgin marbles. We've had the marbles for over 200 years. They're part of our cultural heritage now. Right? Not just so there's the cultural heritage of humankind argument, right? That says, look, nobody owns the past. This is the heritage of everybody. We're just keeping it in stewardship. That's the main argument. But occasionally people make this argument. No, the Elgin marbles are part of British heritage, my culture. Not everybody's. They are my culture stuff, me being a British person now. Right? And so, on your reasoning, giving it back to you is giving up some control of my cultural property. Well, first, there's an issue of do we want to accept sort of might makes right here, and that they've only been able to incorporate it into their cultural history because they were able to force the situation. They were able to take it and enforce it. There's also the issue of primacy, right? I mean, it might be part of the British tradition now, but they didn't make them. The ancestors of the Greeks made that stuff, and it existed in Athens for over 2,000 years. I think they have a more legitimate claim than the British, who have had it in the museum for 200 years. They didn't even make it. All they did was ship it, and in fact, they even sunk some of them. One of the ships sunk. They had to dredge up a bunch of the marbles from the bottom of the sea. And in fact, some of the most impressive stuff, a pair of horses pulling a chariot, they dropped, shattered, gone. Nobody has those. Because they had it in the heart. I mean, because we're talking tons of granite being cut off of a temple that's, I would say, 50 feet tall, maybe 40 feet tall. I've been there. It's pretty big. Right? You got these things weighing a couple tons, 40, 50 feet in the air. Cut it off, and you've got a hoist. What happens when it falls? Shrapnel. Right. Sorry about the aside. Where was I going with that? My point. So I think there's the primacy thing, right? I mean, I know where I was going, right? The British just moved it and have kept it. They didn't make it. The Greeks made it. So I think that gives the Greeks a kind of argument about primacy, about why their cultural concerns trump the British cultural concerns. But lastly, I think there's the issue of minimal sovereignty here. The British kind of keeping the stuff they acquired during the imperial era contributes to their identity as an imperial power, which is no longer the case. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't make them worth less than other folks. It might make them feel like they're worth less than they used to be worth when they had the empire upon which the sun never set, right? But they shouldn't feel that way whether they own the Elgin marbles or not, because it's just no longer true. Whereas the Greeks can claim, we had this stuff for 2,000 years. It's a central kind of iconic stuff, iconic material item from our culture that other people have been controlling for the last 500 years. And so I think there, again, I'm having a problem shifting this idea of minimal sovereignty to states. But I think something like that would apply to the Greeks, but wouldn't apply to the British in there. So I think in all three of those cases, the British lose the argument about whose cultural community matters more for control of the marbles. Although I think they might legitimately say it is part of their cultural community, their cultural heritage now. It's just a weak part of it. It's just a limited part of it. Not having control of that is not a huge dent in their ability to sort of offer their members ways of living a good life.
It's the only thing that I see that differs is that if there are no people who were alive in Greece when Greece had the things, and there are no people alive in Britain when Britain did not have those things, what is the link?
I see. So everybody living now, in living memory, the British have always, the marbles have always been in Britain. And in living memory for the Greeks, they haven't been there.
Yeah. The only access to the cultural importance to the Greeks is what they've read about previous people saying that this was important to us back then.
Can you say that about the same things within the same culture, though? Like the Greeks about their own artifacts that they still have that are 1,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
No one in their culture was alive at that time, but that doesn't make it less.
But I guess it's still in their culture, even if no one recognizes it.
But it sounds like,
I don't know.
But it sounds like it wouldn't be part of the culture then, by your argument, if no one's been alive.
Well, no, because it's still in the country, so.
Yeah.
Like it's tangible, but you don't have to see it type of thing, or...
Well, there are some folks, I know a Greek friend of mine who argues that the Greeks have a right to the marbles because they were created in Athens and there's been a continuously existing Greek culture in Athens the whole time. So I guess the idea is that this is one of those things where I hinted at there's this issue about communities, cultures in general, right? What makes something a continuously existing culture? That's hard to say. It's hard to define what makes something a culture at any particular time is hard to describe, much less through an extended period of time. My friend's argument seems to be, well, the Greeks have a link to the marbles because there have been Greek people made it, and their descendants have lived in the same spot, looking at the same effing things for thousands of years, and some outsider came and took it. And now their descendants, descendants of those same people living in that same place, granted that there's been people from outside moving in. I mean, that's one of the weird things about cultures, right? That modern people living in Greece are probably, in Athens, are probably genetically as related to Turks as they are to the ancient Greeks. Right? So if you went with a biological thing, it would be sort of weird. But culturally, the Greek culture is distinct from the Turkish culture. So I'll admit, you're bringing up